The morning mist clung to the rocky slopes of Cerro Gordo like a shroud, concealing death in its gray embrace. Captain Robert E. Lee crouched behind a boulder, his engineer's eye studying the seemingly impregnable Mexican fortifications that crowned the heights above. It was April 17th, 1847, and General Winfield Scott's army found itself trapped in a narrow pass, facing what appeared to be certain annihilation. "Sir, the Mexican positions are stronger than we initially assessed," Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard whispered, crawling up beside Lee. The young engineer's face was streaked with dirt and sweat from their reconnaissance mission. "General Santa Anna has positioned his artillery perfectly. Any frontal assault up that road would be suicide." Lee nodded grimly, his gaze tracing the elaborate defensive works that General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had constructed across the mountain pass. The Mexican commander, still smarting from his defeat at Buena Vista 2 months prior, had chosen his ground with masterful precision. The main road to Mexico City wound through a narrow gorge between Telegraph Hill and the towering peak of Cerro Gordo itself, creating a natural killing field where Mexican cannons could rain death upon any advancing force. From their concealed position, Lee could see the glint of bronze artillery pieces positioned along the ridge lines. Mexican soldiers moved like ants among the fortifications, their white uniforms stark against the brown earth of their entrenchments. Santa Anna commanded nearly 12,000 men, nearly double Scott's force of 7,000 battle-weary Americans who had been marching inland from Veracruz. The situation was desperate. Scott's army was running low on supplies, and yellow fever was beginning to claim lives in the coastal regions behind them. They could not retreat, yet advancing seemed impossible. The Mexican positions dominated every approach, and Santa Anna had boasted publicly that not even a rabbit could pass through his defenses without his permission. According to military historian Timothy D. Johnson's analysis in Winfield Scott, The Quest for Military Glory, the American position at Cerro Gordo represented one of the most challenging tactical situations faced by any American army during the 19th century. The narrow pass offered no room for maneuver, and the Mexican artillery enjoyed both superior positioning and numerical advantage. General Scott stood with his staff officers, studying maps spread across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition boxes. His imposing figure cast a long shadow in the early morning light, and despite the dire circumstances, his voice remained steady and confident. "Gentlemen, we face a formidable opponent in a nearly impregnable position. However, I have learned never to underestimate the ingenuity of American soldiers when their backs are against the wall." "With respect, General," Major General David Emanuel Twiggs interjected, "our scouts report that every path up those heights is heavily defended. The Mexicans have had weeks to prepare their positions. Perhaps we should consider negotiating a withdrawal back to Veracruz." Scott's eyes flashed with determination. "Retreat is not an option, General Twiggs. We have come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. Captain Lee, what did your reconnaissance reveal about the terrain north of the main road?" Lee spread out his hastily sketched map, pointing to a series of barely visible lines representing potential routes through the mountainous terrain. "Sir, there may be a path around the northern slopes of Cerro Gordo itself. It would be treacherous, and we would need to move artillery pieces up slopes that seem impossible to climb, but it might allow us to flank their positions." The assembled officers studied the crude map with growing interest. The proposed route would require incredible physical endurance and engineering skill, but it offered the only hope of avoiding the slaughter that awaited them in the pass below. The pre-dawn darkness of April 18th provided cover as Captain Lee led a select team of engineers and soldiers up the treacherous northern slopes of Cerro Gordo. Each step required careful placement, as loose rocks threatened to cascade down the mountainside and alert Mexican sentries to their presence. The men moved like shadows, carrying ropes, picks, and surveying equipment that would determine whether Scott's desperate gamble could succeed. Lieutenant Beauregard followed close behind Lee, his breathing labored from the steep climb. Behind them, a carefully chosen group of soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Regiment moved with practiced silence, their muskets slung across their backs to keep their hands free for climbing. Every man understood that discovery would mean not only their own deaths, but the destruction of the entire American army trapped below. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern horizon, Lee raised his hand, signaling the group to halt. They had reached a narrow ledge that offered a commanding view of the Mexican positions. From this vantage point, the vulnerability of Santa Anna's seemingly impregnable defenses became apparent. The Mexican general had concentrated his forces to defend against an attack along the main road, leaving his flanks lightly guarded. "My God," whispered Sergeant Major John Coffee Hayes, a veteran of the Texas Revolution who had joined Scott's expedition as a scout. "Look at those artillery positions. If we can get our own guns up here, we'll have them in enfilade. They'll be completely exposed." Lee studied the terrain through his field glasses, his engineer's mind calculating angles and distances. The Mexican fortifications, so formidable when viewed from the front, appeared vulnerable from this elevated position. However, the challenge of moving artillery pieces up these steep slopes seemed almost insurmountable. "We'll need to cut a path wide enough for the guns," Lee murmured, tracing a potential route with his finger. "It will require moving tons of rock and creating switchbacks where none exist naturally. The men will have to work through the night without making enough noise to alert the Mexican pickets." The sound of voices drifted up from below as Mexican soldiers began their morning routine. Smoke rose from cooking fires scattered throughout their encampments, and the clatter of equipment being cleaned and inspected echoed off the rocky walls of the pass. Santa Anna's army appeared confident and relaxed, certain that their positions were unassailable. Beauregard pulled out his notebook and began sketching the Mexican positions, marking the location of artillery batteries and estimating the number of troops in each defensive work. "Sir, I count at least 30 cannon positioned along the main ridge. If we can surprise them from this angle, they won't be able to traverse their guns quickly enough to respond effectively." The reconnaissance team spent the morning mapping potential routes and identifying key Mexican positions. As detailed in K. Jack Bauer's comprehensive study, The Mexican War, 1846 to 1848, Lee's reconnaissance work at Cerro Gordo demonstrated the crucial importance of thorough terrain analysis in 19th-century warfare. By mid-morning, Lee had seen enough. The flanking maneuver was possible, but it would require superhuman effort from the American soldiers and unprecedented cooperation between infantry, artillery, and engineer units. The path would have to be cut entirely by hand, using tools that were never designed for such massive earth-moving projects. "Sergeant Major Hayes, select your best climbers and have them begin marking trees for removal along the route we've identified," Lee ordered. "We'll need every available axe and pick in the army. This path must be completed before tomorrow's dawn, or we'll lose the element of surprise." As the team began their descent back to the American lines, Lee couldn't shake the feeling that they were attempting something that had never been tried before in military history. The logistics alone seemed impossible, moving heavy artillery pieces up slopes so steep that men could barely maintain their footing, all while remaining completely silent and undetected by enemy forces positioned less than half a mile away. The fate of Scott's entire expedition now rested on whether American soldiers could accomplish what every military manual insisted was impossible. The next 24 hours would test not only their physical strength and endurance, but their willingness to attempt the seemingly impossible when everything they held dear hung in the balance. The evening of April 18th brought a cacophony of controlled chaos to the American encampment. While Mexican sentries maintained their vigilant watch over the main road, hundreds of American soldiers began the most ambitious engineering project of the war. Working in shifts to avoid exhaustion, they attacked the mountainside with picks, shovels, axes, and bare hands, transforming Lee's theoretical path into a reality that could accommodate artillery. Captain Lee moved among the working parties like a man possessed, adjusting angles, redirecting efforts, and solving problems that arose with each foot of progress. The path had to maintain a gradient shallow enough for horses to pull the heavy cannons, while remaining narrow enough to escape detection from Mexican observers. Every tree that fell had to be carefully lowered to prevent noise, and every load of displaced rock had to be carried away by hand to avoid creating telltale debris piles. "Captain, we're making good progress on the lower section," reported Lieutenant George Brinton McClellan, a young engineer whose enthusiasm had proven invaluable during the grueling work. "However, we've encountered solid rock about halfway up the ridge. The men are having to use crowbars and sledgehammers to break through." Lee winced at the thought of hammer blows echoing across the valley toward Mexican positions. "Have them wrap the hammerheads in canvas and work in smaller groups. We cannot afford to alert Santa Anna's pickets to our activities." The work continued through the night by the light of carefully shielded lanterns. Soldiers from multiple regiments had volunteered for the dangerous assignment, understanding that success depended on their willingness to attempt what military doctrine considered impossible. Men who had marched hundreds of miles from Veracruz now found themselves transformed into mountain road builders, using techniques that would have challenged experienced civilian construction crews. Colonel William Selby Harney supervised the movement of artillery pieces to the base of the newly cut path. The guns selected for the flanking maneuver were relatively light 12-pounder howitzers, but even these weapons weighed nearly 800 pounds each, not including their carriages and ammunition. Moving them up the steep incline would require teams of soldiers working in coordinated relays. "Sir, the Mexican pickets have been remarkably quiet tonight," observed Major William Wing Loring, who commanded one of the infantry regiments assigned to the flanking force. "Either they're completely unaware of our activities, or they're planning something we haven't anticipated." Lee paused in his supervision of the road construction to consider this possibility. Santa Anna was an experienced commander who had survived decades of Mexican political and military turmoil. It seemed unlikely that such a veteran would leave his flanks completely unguarded, regardless of how impregnable his main positions appeared. "Double the security patrols along our route," Lee decided. "If the Mexicans have detected our movement, we need to know immediately. This entire operation depends on achieving complete surprise." As documented in John S. D. Eisenhower's detailed account, So Far from God, the U.S. War with Mexico, 1846 to 1848, the engineering challenges faced by Lee's construction teams at Cerro Gordo exceeded anything previously attempted by American military forces. By 3 o'clock in the morning of April 19th, the path had been extended nearly two-thirds of the way up the mountain. Exhausted soldiers continued their relentless work, driven by the knowledge that failure would doom their comrades to a frontal assault against impossible odds. The sound of picks striking stone and axes biting into wood had become a steady rhythm that somehow remained below the threshold of Mexican detection. General Scott himself climbed partway up the new path to assess progress, his bulky form moving surprisingly gracefully among the rocks and tree stumps. His presence energized the working parties, who doubled their efforts despite their exhaustion. "Captain Lee, this is extraordinary work," Scott declared, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we can position our artillery on that ridge by dawn, Santa Anna will face the same impossible situation that confronted us yesterday. His entire defensive scheme will collapse." Lee nodded, though his expression remained concerned. "Sir, we still need to move the guns up the steepest section of the path. That will be the most dangerous part of the entire operation. If we lose control of one of those cannon on the narrow track, it could destroy everything we've accomplished." The general studied the route ahead, calculating the risks involved in the final phase of their desperate gambit. Dawn was only 3 hours away, and everything depended on their ability to complete the impossible within that narrow window of time. The final hours before dawn on April 19th tested every limit of human endurance and ingenuity. American soldiers worked with desperate efficiency to complete the most challenging section of Lee's mountain path, knowing that Mexican sentries would spot their activities once daylight revealed the extent of their night's work. Teams of men strained against ropes and levers, inching the heavy artillery pieces up slopes so steep that each step risked sending everything tumbling back down the mountainside. Captain Lee positioned himself at the most treacherous point in the route, where the path curved around a massive boulder outcropping. Here, the newly cut track was barely wide enough for the artillery carriages, and a single miscalculation could send a 1,200-pound cannon crashing into the valley below, alerting every Mexican soldier within miles to the American flanking movement. "Easy now, easy," whispered Sergeant Patrick O'Brien of the 1st Artillery Regiment, his thick Irish brogue barely audible as he guided a team of 8 soldiers maneuvering the first howitzer around the dangerous curve. Sweat poured down their faces despite the cool mountain air, and their muscles trembled from the sustained effort of controlling the massive weight on the unstable terrain. Lieutenant McClellan supervised the placement of wooden blocks and rope anchors that would prevent disaster if the soldiers lost control of their burden. Every few yards, the procession had to pause while engineers reinforced the path or adjusted the route to accommodate the artillery carriages. The work required perfect coordination between dozens of men working in nearly complete darkness. "Sir, we're getting reports that Mexican patrols are becoming more active," reported Major Loring, climbing up from the American lines below. "Our pickets have spotted movement along their perimeter, and there's been increased activity around their artillery positions. They may be preparing for something." Lee felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. If Santa Anna had detected their flanking movement, the entire American force could be walking into a trap. However, turning back now was impossible. They had committed too many resources to the operation, and retreat would leave Scott's army in an even more desperate position than before. "How many guns have reached the summit?" Lee asked, checking his pocket watch in the dim starlight. "2 howitzers are in position, with a 3rd nearly there," McClellan reported. "The 4th gun is having difficulties with the steepest section. The carriage wheel caught in a crevice, and the men are having to lift the entire piece manually." The sound of strained voices and creaking equipment drifted through the darkness as soldiers fought to free the trapped artillery piece. Every minute of delay increased the risk that daylight would expose their positions before they could achieve tactical surprise. Lee made a quick decision that demonstrated the calculated risks inherent in military leadership. "Leave the 4th gun where it is, and have those men help position ammunition for the pieces that have reached the top. We'll work with 3 howitzers rather than risk losing everything for the sake of one more weapon." As the first pale light began to appear on the eastern horizon, American artillery crews worked frantically to prepare their guns for action. The howitzers had to be precisely positioned to achieve maximum effect against the Mexican positions while remaining concealed from enemy observers until the moment of attack. According to military historian Robert W. Johansson's analysis in To the Halls of the Montezumas, The Mexican War in the American Imagination, the positioning of artillery at Cerro Gordo represented one of the finest examples of tactical surprise in 19th-century warfare. Captain Lee studied the Mexican positions through his field glasses, noting the placement of enemy artillery and estimating the number of troops in each defensive work. From their elevated position, the Americans could observe the entire Mexican defensive scheme, identifying weaknesses that had been invisible from the valley floor. "The Mexican left flank is almost completely undefended," Lee observed, pointing toward a series of ridges that extended north from the main road. "If we can coordinate our artillery bombardment with an infantry assault along those heights, we might be able to roll up their entire line." General Scott himself had climbed the treacherous path to observe the final preparations, his presence providing reassurance to the exhausted soldiers who had accomplished the impossible during their night of superhuman effort. The sight of their commanding general sharing their dangers reinforced their confidence in the desperate plan they had executed with such remarkable skill and determination. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains of central Mexico, and the moment of truth was finally at hand. At precisely 6:30 in the morning of April 19th, the mountain silence exploded into chaos as American howitzers opened fire from their impossible positions high above the Mexican fortifications. The first salvo caught Santa Anna's army completely by surprise, with artillery shells crashing into defensive works that had never been designed to withstand attack from such an angle. Captain Lee watched through his field glasses as confusion spread through the Mexican ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who had awakened confident in their impregnable positions suddenly found themselves exposed to plunging fire from American guns that appeared to have materialized out of thin air. The carefully constructed defensive scheme that Santa Anna had spent weeks perfecting began to collapse within minutes of the opening bombardment. "Direct fire on their main battery," Lee shouted to Lieutenant Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who commanded one of the howitzer crews. The young artillery officer nodded grimly and adjusted his gun's elevation, sending shells screaming toward the Mexican cannons that had dominated the main road through the pass. The Mexican response was swift but chaotic. Artillery pieces that had been positioned to sweep the valley floor attempted to traverse and elevate to engage the American guns on the heights, but their defensive positions had not been designed for such maneuvers. Several Mexican cannons toppled from their mounts as crews tried desperately to return fire against enemies who seemed to be attacking from impossible positions. From his command post in the valley, General Scott watched the artillery duel with professional satisfaction. The months of careful planning and the previous night's superhuman effort had achieved exactly the result he had hoped for. Santa Anna's supposedly invincible defensive positions were being systematically destroyed by American guns firing from locations the Mexican general had considered inaccessible. "Signal the infantry assault," Scott commanded, raising his sword toward the heights where American soldiers were already beginning their advance. The flanking movement had created an opportunity that could not be wasted, and timing would be crucial to achieving complete success. Colonel Harney led the 2nd Brigade up the slopes toward the Mexican left flank, his soldiers moving with the confidence of men who had already achieved the impossible. The steep terrain that had protected Santa Anna's positions now worked to American advantage, as Mexican defenders found themselves unable to maneuver effectively while under fire from multiple directions. The battle quickly developed into a series of individual actions as American assault teams attacked Mexican defensive positions that were no longer mutually supporting. According to Justin Harvey Smith's definitive study, The War with Mexico, published in 1919, the coordination between American artillery and infantry at Cerro Gordo demonstrated tactical innovations that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Major Loring's regiment struck the northernmost Mexican positions just as the artillery bombardment reached its peak intensity. Mexican soldiers, many of whom had been awakened by the sound of shells exploding in their own fortifications, offered sporadic resistance before beginning to retreat toward positions that offered better protection from the devastating American fire. "Keep moving forward!" Loring shouted to his men, his voice barely audible above the crash of artillery and the crack of musket fire. "Don't give them time to reorganize their defenses." The psychological impact of the surprise attack proved as devastating as the physical destruction caused by American artillery. Mexican troops who had considered their positions unassailable suddenly found themselves fighting a battle they had never anticipated, against enemies approaching from directions they had assumed were impossible to attack. Captain Lee continued to direct the howitzer fire from his position on the heights, adjusting targets as the tactical situation developed below. The success of the flanking movement was exceeding even his most optimistic expectations, but he understood that the battle was far from over. Santa Anna commanded a large and experienced army, and the Mexican general would not surrender without attempting to salvage something from the developing disaster. "Sir, Mexican reinforcements are moving up from their reserve positions," reported Lieutenant Beauregard, pointing toward formations of white-uniformed soldiers advancing along the main road. "It appears Santa Anna is preparing a counterattack to retake the northern heights." Lee studied the approaching Mexican troops through his field glasses, calculating their numbers and probable objectives. The success achieved by the surprise attack had created new opportunities, but it had also exposed American forces to potential counterattack if Santa Anna could coordinate an effective response. The battle for Cerro Gordo was entering its most critical phase. By mid-morning, the Mexican defensive line was disintegrating under the relentless pressure of coordinated American attacks from multiple directions. General Santa Anna, his elaborate uniform still immaculate despite the chaos surrounding his headquarters, rode frantically between crumbling defensive positions, attempting to rally his demoralized troops and organize a coherent response to the devastating flanking attack. Captain Lee observed the Mexican general's desperate efforts from his artillery position on the heights, noting how Santa Anna's attempts to redeploy his forces were being frustrated by the continuing American bombardment. Mexican units that attempted to move between positions found themselves exposed to deadly accurate fire from the howitzers that had achieved such complete tactical surprise. "Their entire left wing is collapsing," Lieutenant Jackson reported, his voice hoarse from shouting commands over the thunderous artillery barrage. "Mexican troops are abandoning their positions and streaming back toward the main road." The retreat was becoming a rout as Mexican soldiers, many of them raw recruits who had never experienced such intense combat, threw down their weapons and fled toward what they hoped would be safety in the rear areas. However, American infantry units advancing along the ridge lines were systematically cutting off potential escape routes, trapping large numbers of Mexican troops in positions where continued resistance was impossible. Colonel Harney's brigade had captured the northernmost Mexican artillery positions, turning the captured cannons against their former owners and adding to the devastating fire that was sweeping the Mexican defensive line. The sight of their own guns being used against them completed the demoralization of Santa Anna's army, and organized resistance began to collapse along the entire front. "General Scott's compliments, sir," called out Lieutenant Zealous Bates Tower, climbing up the treacherous path that had made the victory possible. "The general requests that you maintain artillery fire on the main road to prevent Mexican forces from organizing a defensive line further south." Lee nodded and directed his gun crews to shift their fire toward the road junction where Mexican troops were attempting to establish a rallying point. The plunging fire from the heights made it impossible for Santa Anna's forces to maintain coherent formations, and the retreat was rapidly becoming a complete rout. The personal drama of Santa Anna's escape added a theatrical element to the American victory. As documented in Pedro Santoni's scholarly work, Mexicans at Arms, Puro Federalists, and the Politics of War, 1845 to 1848, the Mexican general's narrow escape from capture at Cerro Gordo became part of the folklore surrounding one of Mexico's most controversial military leaders. Santa Anna himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his carriage and personal effects as American cavalry pursued the remnants of his army southward along the Mexico City road. The abandoned carriage contained the Mexican general's correspondence, maps, and even his spare wooden leg, providing American intelligence officers with valuable information about Mexican defensive plans and political divisions. Major Loring's regiment, advancing along the southern ridgeline, captured hundreds of Mexican prisoners who had been cut off from their retreat routes. Many of these soldiers expressed amazement at the American ability to position artillery in locations they had considered impossible to attack, crediting their defeat to what they believed was supernatural intervention rather than superior engineering and determination. "Sir, we've captured their entire artillery train," reported Captain Edmund Bradford Alexander, whose engineers had played a crucial role in the night march that made victory possible. 22 cannons, including several heavy pieces that were positioned to dominate the main road. The Mexican gunners abandoned everything when our flanking attack began. The magnitude of the American success at Cerro Gordo extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Santa Anna's army, considered one of Mexico's finest military forces, had been completely destroyed as an effective fighting unit. Thousands of Mexican soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured, while American casualties remained remarkably light considering the complexity and audacity of the operation. Captain Lee surveyed the battlefield from his position on the heights, observing the scattered remnants of what had been a formidable defensive position only hours before. The success of the flanking maneuver had vindicated Scott's faith in American ingenuity and determination, demonstrating that seemingly impossible obstacles could be overcome through careful planning, skillful execution, and the willingness to attempt what conventional military doctrine considered impossible. The road to Mexico City now lay open before the American Army. The afternoon sun of April 19th cast long shadows across the battlefield of Cerro Gordo, illuminating a scene that would be remembered as one of the most remarkable tactical victories in American military history. Captain Lee stood among the captured Mexican artillery pieces, their bronze barrels gleaming in the afternoon light, physical evidence of an achievement that had seemed impossible only 24 hours earlier. General Scott surveyed the battlefield with the satisfaction of a commander who had vindicated his reputation through audacious planning and flawless execution. The victory at Cerro Gordo had not only opened the road to Mexico City, but had also demonstrated the tactical innovations that would influence American military doctrine for generations to come. The successful flanking maneuver had proven that traditional defensive positions, no matter how formidable, could be overcome through superior engineering, careful reconnaissance, and the willingness to attempt what conventional wisdom deemed impossible. Captain Lee, your reconnaissance work and path construction have achieved something unprecedented in military history, Scott declared, his voice carrying across the captured Mexican positions. This victory will be studied in military academies for decades to come as an example of how American ingenuity can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The human cost of the battle reflected the completeness of the American tactical surprise. Mexican casualties numbered in the thousands, including many of Santa Anna's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. American losses were remarkably light, with fewer than 50 killed and wounded, a testament to the effectiveness of the flanking maneuver that had avoided the bloody frontal assault that Santa Anna had anticipated. Lieutenant McClellan supervised the inventory of captured equipment, which included not only the 22 artillery pieces, but also thousands of small arms, tons of ammunition, and valuable intelligence documents that provided insights into Mexican defensive plans for the approaches to Mexico City. The magnitude of the material capture demonstrated how completely Santa Anna's defensive scheme had collapsed under the weight of tactical surprise. "Sir, we've discovered Santa Anna's personal correspondence," reported Major Loring, holding a leather satchel that had been abandoned during the Mexican general's hasty escape. The documents include detailed maps of the defenses around Mexico City and political assessments of various Mexican leaders. This intelligence could prove invaluable for future operations. The political implications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Santa Anna's defeat at Cerro Gordo undermined his credibility with the Mexican government and people, contributing to the political instability that would hamper Mexican resistance efforts throughout the remainder of the war. The psychological impact of such a complete defeat, achieved through what appeared to be impossible tactical maneuvers, demoralized Mexican forces and strengthened American confidence in their ultimate victory. As evening approached, American soldiers began the process of consolidating their remarkable victory. The path that Lee had cut through the mountains during the previous night's superhuman effort would remain as a permanent testament to American engineering skill and determination. Local Mexican civilians would later name the route El Camino del Diablo, the Devil's Road, reflecting their amazement at what American soldiers had accomplished in a single night of desperate work. The lessons learned at Cerro Gordo would influence American military thinking throughout the remainder of the 19th century and beyond. According to Russell F. Wegley's authoritative study, The American Way of War, A History of United States Military Strategy and Policy, the battle demonstrated the importance of thorough reconnaissance, innovative engineering solutions, and the willingness to risk everything on audacious tactical maneuvers when facing seemingly impossible odds. Captain Lee's role in the victory established his reputation as one of the Army's most promising officers, earning him recognition that would influence his career trajectory for decades to come. The young engineer who had conceived and executed the impossible flanking maneuver would later apply similar innovative thinking to both engineering projects and military operations throughout his distinguished career. The Battle of Cerro Gordo entered American military folklore as proof that determined soldiers, led by competent officers and inspired by audacious planning, could overcome any obstacle. The victory demonstrated that American military forces, when properly led and adequately motivated, possessed the technical skill and moral courage necessary to achieve what their enemies considered impossible. As the American Army prepared to continue its advance toward Mexico City, the soldiers who had accomplished the impossible at Cerro Gordo carried with them the confidence that comes from having overcome the greatest challenges through superior planning, flawless execution, and unshakable determination to succeed against all odds. The mountain pass that had threatened to become their grave had instead become the scene of their greatest triumph, a testament to the power of American grit when applied to seemingly impossible challenges. The road to the Mexican capital lay open, conquered not through overwhelming force, but through the ingenuity and determination that would define the American military character for generations to come.